my name is Marta, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow with the Kremble Center for Neuroinformatics at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto.
Hi, I'm Laura Stigstrom, and I'm a CHR Health System Impact Fellow at CAMH, as well as an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology at the University of Toronto.
And we'll be presenting some preliminary findings from our rapid review, which examines race and racialization in mental health research and their implications for developing and evaluating machine learning models. We conducted this review with our co-authors, Nelson Shen and Iman Kassan, who are members of the Digital Mental Health Research Lab at CAMH, and also in collaboration with Terry Rodak, who is a librarian at CAMH. And we'd also like to acknowledge our supervisors, Dr. Sean Hill, Dr. Marcia Gassimi, Dr. Sophie Soclaritis, and Dr. Jillian Strudwick. Next slide. So machine learning models are increasingly being developed to predict mental health outcomes like suicide risk, illness recurrence, or treatment outcomes. For instance, right now there's lots of interest in personalizing treatments for major depression using machine learning modeling. And so these models generally try to predict responses to treatment, typically defined as a reduction in symptom severity, based on information collected about people at baseline, like their initial depression severity, sociodemographic characteristics, illness history, and so on. And so the idea is that if we can better understand the factors associated with treatment response, we can eventually match patients with the most optimal treatments and have the greatest likelihood of decreasing their symptoms and making them better in the long run. Next slide. But this becomes complicated by the fact that depression symptom severity can depend on environmental features that only affect certain groups of people, specifically individuals affected by discrimination related to race or sex. So racial discrimination has been linked to depressive symptoms in many studies, with more discrimination being related to more severe symptoms. So racism is a form of chronic stress with negative effects on mental health for racialized groups. And unique to these groups, there may be ways that individuals cope with racism that are related to depression. So one example of this is something called racism-related vigilance, which is this tendency to attend to environmental cues that could be perceived as racist and to deal with situation with greater preparation to prevent or reduce discrimination. And so it's perhaps not surprising that racism-related vigilance has been linked with depression. And this effect of discrimination on depression could be particularly risky for Black women. Black women could be disproportionately affected by discrimination, since not only could they be the target of racial discrimination, but they might also experience sex or discrimination related to sex. Next slide. So it's perhaps not surprising then that race or ethnicity have emerged as predictors of depression outcomes in some studies, making them candidate features for machine learning modeling. And so one large and comprehensive study of various predictors of treatment response in depression included ethnicity among other sociodemographic factors on this table shown here. So it's also widely known that the performance of machine learning models relies heavily on the quality of data that these models are trained on. They do require high quality predictive features to produce accurate or useful results. So if we're using race or ethnicity as a feature to predict outcomes in depression, we want to make sure that we're capturing whatever it is about race or ethnicity that's contributing to these outcomes. In other words, we want this feature operationalized properly in the context of our model so that it's a useful predictor. And when this isn't done properly, biases and inaccuracies can be introduced into the data, which can lead to further health disparities for disadvantaged groups. Next slide.
However, a review from 2008 by Molerson and Holtby of 421 mental health studies concluded that the operationalization of race or ethnicity was superficial, vague, and simplistic. These variables were rarely defined and consistently used as proxies for other constructs. Given that ML models are often trained on demographic features, this inaccurate operationalization presents a barrier to developing useful and fair models. Furthermore, marginalized groups often have less training data available, which may account for more prediction errors in racialized or low-income samples. This bias might be particularly apparent for groups defined by intersecting features such as sex and race. Rapid advancements in ML make it important to revisit how race and ethnicity are measured and operationalized in mental health research, since biases can be amplified when they are based on ML data and their models. Given the urgency of this issue, Our review draws on critical race theory. Critical race theory is an iterative methodology that draws on the collective wisdom of activists and scholars to study and transform how the relationship between race, racism, and power. In particular, CRT emphasizes the importance of examining the ways that racialization, or the social and political process of dividing people into different groups, may condition these distributions. As a result, race should not be used as a proxy for racism. In particular, a tenet of CRT is that racism and disparate health outcomes are the result of complex, changing, and often subtle social and institutional dynamics rather than explicit and intentional prejudices of single individuals. Instead, CRT theorists recommend measuring racialization, which is the process of discrimination at multiple levels, and identities based on intersecting features to identify at-risk populations. Additionally, relevant stakeholders should be involved to define racialization in their own community. To our knowledge, our study is the first to use CRT principles to guide a review of race and ethnicity in recent mental health research. We conducted a rapid review to characterize the current state of collecting race, racialization, and ethnicity data in the context of major depressive disorder. This review updated findings from a previous work, providing current evidence to support policy and decision-making at CAMH, where we are based. We searched Medline, PsycInfo, and CINAHL databases using subject headings, keywords, and Boolean logic to search for MDD, major depressive disorder, and race ethnicity. Search was executed in June 2020 and limited to primary studies of adults published in English after 2005. Articles were selected via title and abstract screen, followed by full text review. Articles were included if they focused on the relationship between major depressive disorder and race or ethnicity. To facilitate timely review, we excluded studies of samples with youth and comorbid physical conditions such as diabetes. Sorry. Drawing on Ford and Irembois, who developed this 10 principles for public health critical race theory praxis, we developed a data extraction template to extract a range of features related to critical race theory. This template, which is shown here. However, for today, we will only focus on 4 of these 10 principles. In particular, we focus on race as a social construct, the process of racialization, intersectionality, and voice.
So from our search, we got over 10,000 citations, which we screened for duplicates. This left us with almost 6,000 unique citations to screen. We went through their titles and abstracts, and we selected 975 citations for full text review. And then based on that full text review, 207 papers were eligible for analysis. So the findings we report here are based on these 207 papers. Next slide. So the table on the left here shows the number of eligible studies conducted by year, starting from the year 2005, since we excluded studies conducted before then. So the studies were conducted until 2019, with most studies conducted in 2011. Following this year, the number of eligible studies seems to taper off. The table on the right shows where the studies were conducted. So you'll see that most were conducted in the US, followed by the Netherlands, Canada, Malaysia, and other countries. Sample sizes were pretty diverse. They ranged from 12 to over 800,000. The mean was around 9,000 with a median sample size of 381. There was also a very large standard deviation of almost 60,000. And so most of the studies with smaller sample sizes were qualitative in nature, whereas larger studies tended to be genetic analyses or based on data from electronic health records. Next slide.
Approximately 1/3 or 35% of the studies provided no clear definition of race or ethnicity. And in particular, race was most often used as a proxy for the experience of racism or a specific nationality or culture, such as diet.
So this slide shows a word cloud of the words or descriptors used to refer to the various races or ethnicities considered across the 207 studies. There were 267 unique terms used, since some studies focused on comparing multiple groups, but the word cloud only shows 97 of them, with larger terms indicating more frequent use. So you'll see here that African American and white samples were most commonly studied, followed by Latinx, Black, other, and Asian groups. But most descriptors, about 74% of them, were unique or only used in one study. So there doesn't seem to be a common language or manner of describing groups based on race or ethnicity across the literature. Next slide. So race and ethnicity was self-reported in 73% of studies, and other forms of measurement were rare. Many studies, though, didn't report this method of measurement, so in many cases, the source of the data was unclear. 22% of studies provided a clear criteria for excluding groups. Often this was due to a focus on a specific racial or ethnic sample. So for example, studies might try to understand how depressive symptoms are expressed in Asian American students attending predominantly white colleges. And so in this case, they would report excluding other groups of students from their analysis. But of the studies that did provide their criteria for excluding these certain groups, about a quarter excluded groups based on small samples, and this often involved Indigenous or First Nation samples. Next slide.
Contrary to the principles of CRT, most studies did not measure racialization, and often using self-reported race as a proxy for interpersonal discrimination. Only half of the studies measured exposure to racism and discrimination, and most of these, or 81%, focused on discrimination at an interpersonal level. The most commonly used measure of racialization was the everyday discrimination scale, but many others exist. Third, at least 60% of the studies did not focus on any intersectional identities, and of those that did, most focused on the intersection between gender and racism, or racism and sexual identity. Finally, only 8% of the studies involved racialized participants in the research process at any stage.
So in conclusion, these preliminary findings from our rapid review highlight persisting limitations in mental health research on how race-related data is collected, operationalized, and reported. These limitations can present barriers to machine learning modeling if we eventually would like to compile data across research studies or across different settings, for example, different health systems. Descriptions of racial or ethnic groups were diverse, so it's difficult to compile or meaningfully classify race or ethnicity data. So for example, if some studies refer to a group as African American and others refer to this group as Black, is it appropriate to group these together when building a training data set? So we really need some consensus on how these groups are described and defined, informed by CRT. And we also found that marginalized groups were often excluded due to small sample sizes, suggesting that these groups could be underrepresented in machine learning modeling. This introduces issues of generalizability. For example, if we tend to exclude Indigenous or First Nations individuals from research, how will we know if our machine learning models can be applied or deployed on these groups? How will we know if model performance is biased for these groups? Or how will we know if this bias only extends to Indigenous women or groups defined by other intersectional identities? And often there was a lack of clarity around the source of demographic data. And this makes it difficult to gauge its quality. As we mentioned earlier, high quality features are important for machine learning modeling. Next slide. So overall, we've found that there's a real need to improve the collection of race-related data in mental health research. The absence of accurate data limits the development of useful and fair machine learning models. And if we would like to use machine learning modeling to improve mental health care, for example, by personalizing treatments for depression, we need to address these limitations in the way we operationalize race and ethnicity and develop better reporting practices.
Finally, without these improvements, we are most likely to amplify rather than resolve health inequities with technologies intended to support the mental health of at-risk groups. In particular, we feel that a continued use of race as a proxy for other constructs, especially racism, reinforces the idea that race is stable, biological construct rather than a social, political process of differentiation, which is felt differently across time and specific contexts. Thank you. Finally, we would like to acknowledge our funders, CIHR Institute of Health Research, for funding this. We would also like to thank CAMH and the Kreml Center for Neuroinformatics, and of course our co-authors and our supervisors. And here we have included a list of our references that we cited throughout the presentation. We're happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you.